Good morning. I'm News Center Maine's Don Carrigan here for this week's edition of Political Brew, joined by Republican analyst Phil Harriman, and joining us remotely this morning, Democratic analyst Ethan Strimling. Thank you both for being with us.
Good morning.
Lot going on. What a surprise that is. In Maine, a big event at the State House this week with the 5 tribal chiefs addressing the legislature. The first time, as all of them, the first time the tribal chiefs have spoken, given a State of the Tribes address since 2002. This comes, of course, at the same time we're having again discussions with the tribes and the legislature and the administration about returning sovereignty to the tribes. Phil, I'll start with you. How significant is this?
Oh, it's so important. This is Native American, Native Mainers who have a seat in the legislature. They don't vote, but they have a seat to monitor the legislature. So I do think it is appropriate and important for their voice to be heard and understood. There's a lot of ongoing discussions about what role they play in self-governing and whether they're a municipality in the Indian land claim settlement in 1980. So there's a lot there to unpack, and they should be heard.
And all of the chiefs in their remarks to the legislature and by extension to the governor and the people of Maine were saying, give us back the sovereignty, self-determination, self-government, and all that. There are some who don't want that, but the legislature gave them a very warm welcome.
They did, yeah, and as they should. But I think, if you go back to that 1980 land claim settlement, $80 million plus agreement, there was language in there that creates the way we and they govern themselves today. And going back and revisiting that is probably a complicated discussion.
I'm sure it is. Ethan, what do you think about that? Is this both an issue whose time has come, but also the reception that tribal chiefs received in the legislature?
Issue that is long time overdue for sure. As Phil mentioned, the Land Claims Act that was put in place, that's over 40 years ago. And obviously, as we look back on it, there are pieces of it that need to be addressed. Just oftentimes we have treaties all the time with countries and they are readdressed. New administrations come in, you find out what needs to work better. And I think the tribes, I really appreciate that the tribes are willing to do this, willing to step up and say, we're going to address your legislature, put some of our concerns on the table. Good for the leadership in the legislature for welcoming them and having this. The last time this happened, it was before I was in the legislature. I wish it had happened while I was there. I think the issue of trying to find sovereignty, ways for them to be more sovereign, to be able to govern their own lands the way tribes do all across the country, I think is something very important for the state of Maine to reconcile with. Very disappointed that Governor Mills was not there. Just a bad misstep on her part to not be there, not send anybody, to sort of keep this arm's distance from them. It just doesn't look good, and it's not going to help us resolve this issue in a way that's best for the state of Maine and for the tribes.
Her press secretary told us several days previous that the governor could not be there for the speeches because of a prior commitment. She did offer to meet with the tribes earlier that morning. The chiefs said they couldn't arrange it. Both sides have told us they want to meet and get together, but there's clearly a strained relationship there, isn't there?
Yes, for sure. There's a strained relationship. I mean, the governor made very clear that she was not going to support the sovereignty bill that went through last year. It ended up not even coming out of the Appropriations Committee, avoided her veto for those reasons because the legislature smartly said, we don't need to put the tribes in the middle of this fight. So, she's made very clear her position that she doesn't want them to have any more sovereignty so far. And so I think it would have been a really important gesture, a good gesture, a gesture of trying to bring the state together to be there or to make sure that a very high level person was there listening and representing her administration.
Phil, do you agree with that?
Well, I do, but I think this, again, as I said earlier, this is a complicated conversation. And in order for there to be resolution, they all ought to sit down in the same room at the same time and be heard and understood.
Congressman Jared Golden was there. He has been involved with the tribes. They certainly showed their appreciation. He was in talking with the chiefs beforehand because we were out in the hall waiting. And then he joined them up on the speaker's platform in the legislature for that event. So clearly there is a relationship there. And of course, the tribes rely on the federal government and want to rely on them more.
Sure. And all success generally begins by showing up. And that's what Jared did. He was the only one within the legislative delegation in Washington who took the time to show up.
And there's an issue that I know, Ethan, this is probably one close to your heart on a totally different topic. Senator Collins is asking the Department of Homeland Security to talk to cities like Portland before more asylum seekers are sent there, to inquire where they're going, and can Portland, for example, hold that many more people? There's been some objection to that. We'll see what happens. But Ethan, what do you think about that idea? There is strain on places like Portland because of those numbers.
Well, let's be clear. They're strained because we're not doing enough to provide housing for people. That's the fundamental issue. And they're strained because the federal government refuses to allow asylees to work from the minute that they get here. The issue should never be don't have them come here. If Senator Collins wants to help, she should be fighting to try to change the law, which she has. She should fight harder to allow asylees to work. She should be fighting to get more resources to these states. But look, if a state opens up a new business and a bunch of people move into that community and there isn't housing, et cetera, the federal government doesn't start saying, don't have people, put a border up on the wall of Maine to tell people not to come here. These are folks we need. These are folks we want. They're the next generation of Mainers. They're the only reason Maine's population hasn't been decreasing. So we want as many people as we can get to come here to be part of our economy. So Senator Collins should be doing more to try to get us the resources we need. And our local and state governments need to build the housing that we need in order to be able to house folks.
Phil, Ethan makes a point, but also we hear lots of cries of help from businesses and government in Portland.
Sure. I think the distinction between Ethan's point, broad perspective policy, yeah, I see what Ethan does as clearly as he does. The difference is that when someone's impacting a community that much, there's a let's go to City Hall, let's have a discussion, let's have a vote. None of that happened. It was more of a open up the bus door and welcome these people.
Right.
They've put a strain on our resources that we didn't anticipate, and now we've got a challenge on our hands.
But should the federal government then say, no, not going to send any more right now?
Well, I think for humanity purposes, the mayor of Portland has made it clear their resources are stretched. Well, adding more people and just piling in more stress on the system is going to leave some people in harm's way. No one wants that.
Okay. A lot of national stuff. Let's start first with this latest problem close to Ukraine with Russian jets harassing our drone in international airspace over international waters, even hitting it, which the Russians deny. Ethan, I'll start with you. How worried should we be that this could escalate?
I'm not that worried that it's going to escalate at the moment. A much bigger concern, of course, is Ukraine and trying to make sure that we manage that situation in a way that protects Ukraine as best as possible, but we don't escalate things into a confrontation between us and Russia. So I feel like the Biden administration's done a good job. They're very clear with Russia about what's okay, what's not okay. I'm sure our Defense Department has everything heightened in terms of trying to make sure to protect our assets. So I'm not worried that this is about to lead to something much bigger. But obviously, we have to stay very vigilant. Putin is a very, very dangerous man. And, allowing him to just invade another country, allowing him to push us around as he was able to do previously, just can't be the American standard.
Phil, this just has so many recollections of 1982 or whatever it might be, and the kind of things that would happen.
Yeah, and I think there's a line there that we have to be careful if we cross it, that we're prepared to take action. For the Russian jet to spill fuel all over this drone deliberately is one act, but to knock it out of the sky is either an aggressive act on purpose or incredible incompetence on the Russian pilot. We need to make sure that we don't overreact. But when you combine this incident with what we're seeing with the Chinese and the Saudi Arabians and Russia, we have to be vigilant.
Yeah, you mentioned the Chinese and Saudi Arabia. The Chinese are becoming much closer in relationships with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis seem very happy to cozy up to the Chinese and perhaps to further annoy the Biden administration. And we know that China is looking for energy sources all over the world. So is that just part of this? Should we be really worried that China is going to have even greater influence in the Middle East?
There's no question about it. And if Saudi Arabia decides to flow more of their energy to China and less to us, that puts us in an even more precarious situation, which perhaps might be an indication why the Biden administration actually let a lease up in Alaska happen to drill for energy.
Right. And is that so? Maybe that decision is as much pointed towards the Saudis as
Yes.
to domestic.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Ethan, what's your take on this?
Energy independence is very important. It's something that we actually achieved a number of years back during the Obama administration for the first time. Obviously, that has swung up and down, back and forth a little bit. But the ultimate answer to all of this is renewable energy, to get off fossil fuels so that we don't have to rely on anyone else. We can simply rely on the sun that we receive and the wind and the tide in order to make sure that we can run our country in a way that both protects the planet and gives us the kind of energy independence we need. So
that, however, is a long-term
Yes.
project. You were 20, 30 years.
Well, it's a long-term project because we keep putting it off, right? We can get there a lot more quickly if we choose to make some very different decisions. But I'm not that concerned. I'm not overly concerned. Similarly, I think to Phil, we have to watch this activity of what's going on between China and Saudi Arabia as China builds its power. We're still a much stronger country than they are. And so I'm not as worried about it. But again, energy independence is the key. And the way that we actually get there is through renewable energy, not through this dependence on fossil fuels. We can never win that war.
Right. Do you agree with Phil's assessment that perhaps the Biden decision and order regarding oil exploration up on the North Slope and up in that area is as much a political shot at Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't know if it's a political shot at Saudi Arabia. It's a bad idea. Shouldn't have done it. We need to focus on renewable energy, as I said, and us finding more ways to drill over and over again is just not going to answer the question. So I'm not sure why he did it, maybe for political reasons, et cetera, but it was the wrong decision. If it was a response to this, it was definitely a wrong decision. If it was simply to try to bring more oil onto our planet, that was also a bad decision.
All right. And Phil, I'm guessing you think it's a good decision.
I do. I'm all in with this discussion on other forms of energy, but in the meantime, let's not cripple the citizens of our country in terms of high energy prices, which is really including food prices and inflation. We all agree on the goal. The goal is on the horizon. We're trying to do this like it's the hood ornament. It's not. It's going to take a while to get there.
Yeah. So the other big headline hitting this week, of course, has been the banking crisis. We have a bank that closes. We have a second one. Others worried about it. Now some other large banks are pumping billions of dollars in. Phil, you're the financial guy here. We're asking about what we should be worried about. How much should we worry about this bank? Is it an actual crisis? Is it just a couple of banks having trouble?
I have two responses. One is the banking regulations that were put in place in 2008 are being tested today. And hopefully this is an example of a bank that really was more into a particular segment of the economy, venture capital, equity capital, social consciousness, and all of those priorities, and lost sight of the fact that there was a reason why people wanted to come and take money out. And I think the second part of your question is that the banks who are sitting on money that they're paying less than 1% interest, they are going to find their customers coming in and taking their money out to get a higher yield. So to the bankers watching Political Brew this morning, call your customers and offer them a higher rate of interest.
Ethan, do you think that's going to happen?
I don't know, but I certainly would take financial advice from Phil. So if they do that, I hope they send them to Phil to be able to try to take care of it. But look, we want to be careful, right? The reason that this is making so much news is because of the size of the bank. Banks do close. 15 to 20 banks closed during the Trump administration. This happens. It was kind of an anomaly that there hadn't been one under the Biden administration. But let's be clear, we aren't testing the 2008. We're testing the 2017 deregulation that occurred under the Trump administration. They put forward regulations to free up because they didn't like Dodd-Frank. The big banks, of course, fought that. Republicans fought it tooth and nail. Thankfully, Obama, Pelosi, everybody got it through, and it's protected our banking industry for almost 15 years. But in 2017, they did put through some amendments that allowed a bank like this, the 16th largest in the country, to claim that they are not in the big enough category to be under the regulations of Dodd-Frank, and that they could have a lower level of supervision. Well, now we see what that's done. So we need to get back to Dodd-Frank and get even stronger before this thing does become a crisis. I do agree with Phil. It's not a crisis yet, but we need to make sure that the banks are very clearly regulated and very heavy oversight.
All right, winners and losers of the week briefly. Ethan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, the winners of the week are the tribes for coming forward, being willing to speak to the legislature despite how they've been treated for so many years. And as I mentioned earlier, the loser of the week, Janet Mills, for not being there, not sending anybody. Just a very disappointing show. Hopefully she steps up now.
All right, thank you. And Phil?
My loser of the week, Don, is those in a position of power to shut down our government and shut down our schools long before the weather events happen. Time to get up and go to work and go to school. My winner of the week is the 400 Maine students who gathered this week for the National Honor Society meeting, where they talked about some of the challenges facing their generation and future leaders of our state and country.
And I have one that I'll mention, winners, a group of Maine game warden trainees and tribal game warden trainees happened to be in the right place at the right time on Moosehead Lake or near Moosehead Lake when some people got lost and separated, and they went out and rescued them.
That's
so
good stuff.
Good start on their career. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us. News Center Maine continues right after this.